My growth around travel began with ambivalence or disinterest in travel. And the reason was simple. I figured that any two people or any three people could get together just about anywhere and have a far more significant experience, if properly designed, than any travel experience, a view of an Eiffel Tower, a look at a Grand Canyon, you know, a, a location. And this came from the fact that, having grown up in New York State, moved to Sussex, England, moved to Cyprus, moved to Scotland, moved to Missouri, moved to Vancouver, Canada. And while I definitely did note that I enjoyed the Canadian culture more than my experience of United States culture, it just, it wasn't the kind of thing. I spent most of my time in my kind of my own cocoon, whether it was meditating or spending time with a particular individual. It just didn't seem like going to a hotel somewhere would provide enough value to be worth the time and effort of doing so. And the other thing is, I'm a refiner or a perfecter and then enjoyer. As an example, the house that I'm in right now is one that I moved in a day, and the biggest choice in the moving in was where to put my crystals, my altar, my bed, etc. There are things in the house that literally have not moved once since I moved in. Objects I put down on a shelf, and it's like, that's where that object goes. Because once I'm satisfied, and if I'm not, I do something immediately about it, but once I'm satisfied, this goes here, this goes here, this goes there, then I'm into enjoyment and embellishment mode. So I have embellished. The green screen wasn't here when I've moved in, nor was, the filming set up. That's an embellishment. Having embellished to a satisfactory point, however, it pretty much stays the same. And when you go into something new, it's very hard to perfect because there's so many unknown variables. And so, I may not discover until I move into the hotel room that there's a noisy neighbor watching TV. Or I didn't discover that the pool smells like chlorine to such a degree that I don't want to go anywhere near it. Or I don't discover that they don't have butter at the buffet, only margarine, or whatever it is. There is bound to be dozens of things off from a new experience. And so to get on a plane and travel somewhere that is bound to be unsatisfactory in some aspect, just never made any sense. And so for quite a while, once I moved into the San Francisco Bay Area, I perfected the San Francisco Bay home, and that I'm still in, and why move when it's perfect? But then I tried to create meaningful interactions with other humans in the Bay Area. And since men, generally speaking, seem to be quite adverse to tenderness, to vulnerability, to sensitivity in the United States, that then pushes me into a dynamic with women. And in my childhood period where the attachment template formed, which is in the first 3 years, one forms, if you have healthy and emotionally available parents, a secure emotional attachment with one and hopefully both parents. I did not have a secure emotional attachment with either parent. And one of the things that resulted from this is without being able to form an emotional attachment that was secure with either parent, and with a fair amount of psychological and some physical trauma, the terrain of bonding to someone else, it's like crossing the Grand Canyon. It's this big gulf. And the in-between, the gradient in what's normally a bell curve of attachment, so you have 0 to nothing, and then you go up to a very strong attachment, and then you taper off. Well, when you form healthy and secure attachments with one or hopefully both parents, one of the things you get to play with, and you watch children go through this stage of kind of peeking out behind mama's skirts and going back and playing and then coming back, is there's a dynamic of you learn regulation, attachment regulation. And I never had that secure, safe emotional attachment. And so I'm very good at feeling like the outsider and unattached. So that's the default. But to go from there into this murky terrain, it's completely unconscious and unknown. And it's in that in-between place of graduated attachment that the traumatic biology seems to reside in my body, because I feel like I'm falling. It's a visceral sense of anxiety and pain unless I'm unattached or I'm attached. And if I'm attached, I want a very strong attachment so that I'm not thrust back into the unknown again of that undecided terrain. And so I've got 2 set points, and it's a very steep climb. Normally in a matter of 3 hours to 3 days, I'm going to form a very strong attachment, or I'm going to dissociate, because that in-between ground is just absolute hell. It's hell physiologically. I mean, I have tried every rational trick in the book, from distracting myself to rationality to writing down. And the bottom line is my, adrenals, cortisol levels, the chemicals are changing a little bit, and my understanding of them is not fluent. But the stress biology symptoms, keep going round and round and round. Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? Until I either disconnect, and there actually has to be a little bit of a ritual for me, like, and this is confusing for other people, very understandably, but, I'll need to at the end of a first date with someone say, are we going to have a second date that you're clear that you want to have, and when's it going to be, or this is it, that this is our last date. If you need to go home and think about it for a week and leave me in hell for a week, forget it. Rationally, I'd love to be able to extend that courtesy to you. I would like nothing better than to be able to put you out of mind, etc., but I can't. My body is going to be in this of a 2-year-old infant wondering if he's going to live. That's what's going on inside, and it does not correlate to any rational thought that I might think or not think. They're 2 separate systems. And my wishes, my knowledge of social etiquette, my logic and reason, all of that is just on another system entirely. I am going to be anxious until I find a secure attachment. Now, absolute bliss for me is a secure attachment with a safe, empathic, sensitive, nurturing woman. And it's, in United States culture, there's a fair amount of shame, judgment, and hostility to need, vulnerability, desperation, and the idea of mixing parent and romance. So you can find in the United States women who have incredible contempt for the idea of a mama's boy or someone that needs holding in that terrain. And it mirrors what those women are basically communicating, is that when they needed someone for a secure emotional attachment, that they were met with contempt. Men have shamed them. Other girlfriends have shamed them. The media has shamed anyone who was in a needy state. And having had one's deepest needs met with contempt creates a very reactive trauma. And having dissociated from the needy part of oneself with contempt and shame, internalizing the wound, then when you meet someone else in a place of need or insecurity or desperation, not only does it kill off the sexuality in many cases, but it is met with the same externalized. So the external wound came in, then was dissociated, now is internalized, now finally it's externalized again towards me being aware that to the degree that I honestly communicate the emotional state in this void, that I'm being met with contempt, disbelief, suspicion. You're just trying to get into my pants, all this kind of stuff. And the whole thing is absolutely horrible. And so in my best relationships, I've been sexual on a first date, formed a secure mutual emotional attachment that is mutually enthusiastic, and built from there. And I've tried polyamorous relationships, and they are by far a second choice for me because they damage the weakness of the attachment. Where I've used polyamorous relationships in this context of attachment dynamic is in the sense of if a woman very commonly in the United States wants to invest maybe 10 to 14 hours a week in relationship, that's not enough for me to have a secure attachment. And so if I have 2 or 3 women who want to have a 10 to 14 hour a week relationship, then the combined, 45 or so hours of 3 partners fills that need. And if one, is moving on, I have some place to go with that anxiety that is reassuring. And so this is just what works. And, as a man in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate culture, as a traumatized man with biology that has 2-year-old memories and 3-year-olds memories in a therapeutic climate where, having done $140,000 in therapy, none of that has ever touched that biology. And I find it fascinating. Therapists love me as a client because I'm articulate. And yet they don't seem to grasp that, that I could talk about this for 10 hours and they enjoy the conversation, but it does not change the biology that I'm going there to attend to. It doesn't change the biology. And so $140,000 later, nada. No difference whatsoever in the underlying biology and no refund. And so, that's the one of the costs of, not only you and I being in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate culture, let alone a mythologically literate culture, but many therapists not even knowing what they don't know, and passing that ignorance on to the client. So one of the interesting things with this early attachment dynamic is that I actually begin to activate that biological signal from the moment I send an email to a woman I haven't met. Meaning, if I connect to an empathic part of me which I do. I look for faces online when I was single. I look for faces online that spoke of kindness, that spoke of presence and empathy. And if I feel that, it's like, I want you to love me. I want you to accept me. And this is the 2-year-old biology that's needing, if I'm to have an emotional connection with that person, I've got to go through that age in the biology and build from there. But that 2-year-old has got to be held in some way. And so, I've written to people online, and then if they don't respond in 48 hours, I've written to them again and say, I'm no longer interested, because you're already communicating to me that this is how you relate. You're not immediately available. You're not a fast connector. You're a wait and see kind of person. I'm never going to be able to get through the anxiety of, falling into whatever your filter is. And so I'm going to say goodbye, and and then I calm down again, because I have an on switch and I have an off switch, and all that beautiful gradient of that bell curve in between is simply not available to me. Rationally, I know what it is. Biologically, I can't. I've never experienced it. And so, this basically means that it's very difficult also to regulate friendship, because I'm attracted to at least 30% of women if they're emotionally available. And that's the key thing. So if I'm single and they're single, and a lot of people in the United States are single, if I'm single and they're single, there's no sense of being able to have a friendship and not a sexual relationship. And so I'm told that the San Francisco Bay Area is very difficult to have deep, time-consuming friendships, more so than, for example, the East Coast, more so than the Heartland. Well, I'm on the West Coast in the Bay Area, in Marin County, California. And so I had, a series of monogamous relationships that were very intense. Like, one of my dates lasted 5 days. It was a fabulous date in terms of checking things off. It was a one-date relationship that lasted 5 days from the moment she walked into my house. And the date was perfect from my perspective. The compatibility wasn't. But within 5 days, we understood exactly where we were and weren't compatible and wished each other well. And that was that. And that was perfect for me. But this is a very, very tiny slice of people. And talking about that online dynamic, even though philosophically I feel like if I can find someone who will prioritize relationship design, show up with their full masculine and feminine parts to co-create, an incredible presence together, if I can do that, I'm in heaven. I don't care where I am as long as it's quiet and there's just two of us. It's very distracting for me, turning back and forth and fitting into group dynamics. And so I tend to either dominate the group dynamic or just feel left out of it, which it's that setting. It's very difficult to have a gradient. Also, the neurology of being unusually sensitive and unusually responsive means that details matter. And so, for most people, they don't need the level of detail that I'm communicating in. But I don't feel connected to the subject or to the person unless this level of detail is going on here. See, like all of this is a preamble to why travel. What was it that led me to break all of those theories that doesn't matter where you are, focus on the people, etc. Well, what led that was, for example, when I wanted to create a peak experience, I tried different angles to creating rapid intensity that would fit within my attachment template. And one of them was to have dates that were designed to be peak experiences. And so I invited 350 women in the Bay Area to consciously design a peak experience. I used OkCupid as a dating app. And 2 women of 350 said yes. Now, those 2 women and I did create a fabulous peak experience. And in the process of experiencing that peak experience, it was also clear that we weren't compatible. But what really alarmed me was that more than 348 women said no. They wanted to meet someone, but they didn't want to create a peak experience. And this is very frustrating from a rational perspective. If you listen to women talk, they're constantly complaining, single women, about the mediocrity and the patheticness of their dates. We just went and had coffee and then this and that. So presumably, all of that would shift if they had a peak experience. You're having mediocre experience because you're designing mediocre dates. That's all you're up for. And then you're complaining about the guy who you're blaming for creating a mediocre experience. I'm suggesting let's create a peak experience, and 99% of you are saying no. 99% of you are saying no. I'd rather have another 10, 20 mediocre dates than a peak experience. But this kind of thing just drives me nuts, because I don't like listening to women complain about mediocre dates, which means I don't want to be set up to be complained about as a mediocre date, one. And two, it doesn't get any more direct and logical to solve than that. Most dates are mediocre, boring, and tedious, granted. They're going to continue to be mediocre and tedious unless you do something. Now, you can either blame the people for that, or you can say that there's something wrong with the dating protocol. Well, I choose the latter. People are not fundamentally at fault. Protocols are. People can be heaven, and they can be hell. Depends on the context and recipe of the engagement. So I burnt out, realizing that not a single woman in my entire life in the United States had ever once invited me to have a peak experience. A stunning statistic. What is a peak experience? A phenomenal event. Why is no one inviting that? So no one had ever invited that, which is a dismal statistic, because then you realize I'm 45 years old. No one has ever invited a peak experience once. That means by the time I'm 80 or 90, no one will have either. I haven't even got one template to say that every 45 years someone's going to invite a peak experience. Nothing. Then I think, do I want to deal with the bullshit I have to go through with 350 women to find 2? And the one was a little hesitant. She wasn't sure she wanted a peak experience. And then she was delighted she came afterwards. The other one said, it sounds too good to be true, and she was from Russia. Now, this brought up some cultural statistical work that I'd been gathering informally. I have met about 10, 15 Russians among thousands, right? Now, 4 to 5 of those Russians have had an extraordinary interaction with me in one way or another, including, this was probably the only Russian in my 350 sampling of Bay Area women, of multiple ages, by the way, anywhere from 20 to 55, 60. I wasn't focusing on age. So this was probably the only Russian in my list of 350 women. And she was the only one that she said, I almost didn't respond because it was too good to be true. It sounded so perfect. And why were you interested in me? This was heaven, And I said, I'm not particularly interested in you or someone else. In this culture, I've got to throw this out to hundreds of people to get one or two intelligent people that actually want a peak experience and are willing to take the risks and take responsibility for creating it. Because it's not like I'm going to give you a peak experience. We're going to build it together, mapping it out, etc. And so, you know, that was a terrific thing. She wanted to be in relationship afterwards, but you know, the time constraints, her lack of transportation and stuff, it just, it's like, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But, you know, given that you're going to prioritize this and this first, and you live here and you don't have a car, I was protecting that sense of being left hanging, which is such a common expense or a common experience in the United States, where there's a deification of openness and a deification of freedom. Whatever works, come on, let's just see what happens. Let's leave things open. No worries, no worries. But underneath that, there's a subset of that population, and I'm part of it, that has tremendous insecurity. But there's no culturally sanctioned way to say, I feel I have insecure attachment dynamic relating to, you know, biological issues in my 0 to 3, and it isn't okay to keep it open. It isn't okay to just see what happens next. I need to structure something that's solid and secure, or I'm going to have to say goodbye. And I believe that in a healthy culture, we deal with things like that, you know, and that's just not, you know, up for grabs in this culture as a possibility. And so the Russian statistics started standing out. Now, what I would call the Russian statistics, so we've got 33% of all the Russians I seem to engage with, you know, in this dynamic, seem incredibly open to extraordinary experiences and uncommon depth of communication. 1. 2, they're all a bit cerebral. The openness is more mental, but there's less warmth. There's less warmth in that dynamic. Openness to sex, openness to deep thinking, openness to diversity, and openness to creativity, and an appreciation of intelligence, but a coolness around warmth and need, etc. But this got me thinking. If 33% of the Russians I meet are completely excited about opportunities that 99% of Americans have no interest in, or their fear is higher than their interest, then what we're dealing with is vast cultural, statistical differences in openness to different kinds of experiences, which then led me to feeling like I'm exhausted with the amount of initiation it takes in the Bay Area to find the 1% who is somewhat hesitantly open to something very new and emotionally vulnerable and intense. I said, but I'll bet there's a country or a town or something, somewhere in the world, where they're like the Russians, meaning that 30% is open and interested but they're also they're also interested and available for deep emotional bonding. So I have to find, if I want to stop this dynamic of exhaustion, irritation, being misunderstood, waiting around for a nothing in a lifetime experience, meaning it hasn't happened once that someone's approached me this way, I've got to go and travel the world. And so it wasn't that I liked traveling. It was, if I could go to a place where 50% of the people, for example, or even 10% would be heaven, where 10% of the people would behave the way that I wanted them to behave, this would be so much less work than hunting to find the 1%, or it's really about 1%. And then you can't just find the 1%, because then you find them and it's like they're married, or they're busy, or so it's less, and so it's a scarcity dynamic to be going through 100 rejections, particularly with early childhood attachment disorder, and finding one who is cautiously open to something like that is miserable. In my dream world, people would be jumping up and down saying, "Who wants to create a peak experience?" And people would be doing it every week, and with multiple different people, and would be ranking the experience and learning, and there'd be a whole community. I tried to start that group, Peak Experiences, on Meetup, and nobody did it. And then I tried to create the last-minute fun events thing, and everyone was too busy. You'd call them at the last minute. They say, "Oh, I'm busy. Call me next week." That's exactly what I was trying to get away from. So I settled on Bali and Thailand. Having traveled Europe, I'd lived in England for 4 years. I went on a European trip, and my favorite place was Denmark, and then next Italy. And Denmark was all about the high quality of life, but there was still an emotional coolness. I wasn't meeting emotional passion and vulnerability and immediacy in Denmark. It was a very cool but very intelligent culture. Italy, a little bit more passion, play, and femininity, but still a slower culture. There wasn't that intensity that I was looking for. And I found that, so I looked at Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and I settled on the Philippines. Now, the Philippines broke the mold in a delightful and refreshing way. As soon as I was on the Filipino dating app, I was being contacted by 20 times the number of women that were contacting me in the United States. So we already have a 2,000% outreach rate. There was also curiosity and emotionality and transparency. There was much less game strategy type dynamic. There was also an immediacy of availability. For example, I found a traveling companion for my 2-week trip just by reaching out to it was probably about 100 Filipinas, and I said, who would like to do these kinds of activities, have these kinds of conversations, have these kinds of experience, if we like each other, be lovers, and travel around the Philippines for 2 weeks. And who would, who's into that? And I'll sort through that. And 3 or 4 people were really into it. And this is at 6 days' notice. And this is going from kind of never talking to 2 weeks of interaction. Now, this is perfect for me. And so it, there were some hiccups and problems. I learned some of the downsides of the Philippines, one of them being honesty. There's about a 50% dishonesty statistic, in my experience with the Philippines. And I've never lied to someone, ever, period. And so in that sense, to go into a culture where there's 50% of the people are going to lie to me, that's a huge problem I haven't had to deal with before. But it solved a huge problem I was dealing with, for years, for decades, which is lack of reciprocal initiation, lack of spontaneity, lack of emotional warmth in a rapid way, and it, and that really met the need for at least the instantaneous attachment. Now, with the dishonesty, it was not a very secure relationship. It turned out the woman I spent 2 weeks with was married and a mother when she said she was single and had no children. I said I would like to spend time with someone who is single, who has no children, so there's no complications. And she was married and had a child. And that's what do you do when someone wants to lie like that? But nevertheless, it gave me hope that the traveling idea, the idea of traveling the globe, etc., was taking me on the right track. Now, my next place was Thailand, where I immediately settled in because the people were incredibly honest and incredibly courteous. Now, here was a new problem. So, very high levels of honesty, very high levels of courtesy, a great deal of emotional responsiveness. It was absolute heaven on those dimensions. No one spoke English. Trying to learn Thai is very difficult. It's a tonal language. And so again, I went through a process there. But so my evolution in travel, and then I reached out to 5,000 Thai women very lightly, invited 1,000 Thai women to read a book that I wrote and then translated into Thai, talked with 250, and then, met closely with 4, was lovers with 3, and moved towards marriage with 1, and, was too culturally incompatible. Having exhausted that interaction with 5,000 Thai women, moving back to the Philippines with a more discerning eye, can I find someone that has that warmth and spontaneity and speaks English and is honest? And in that dynamic, I met, a lovely young woman that kind of moved a bit towards marriage. She was a little bit young though, and didn't really fall in love with me, and so that pulled back out. Then I met my wife, and a very strong emotional attachment, very immediate, and now, going through the immigration process, we're now in the U.S. But that is, a process of first looking at travel as kind of an entertainment and being uninterested, then looking at travel as a cultural exploration and as a way to more easily connect with parts of my own psyche through connecting with cultures that connected with those psyches, in which I could explore those parts of me because they were present in those cultures. And Thailand is by far the winner of any place I've been on the planet, in terms of it is 1,000%, 10 times easier to have the kind of interactions I want to have in Thailand. And so then I started spending more and more time in either the Philippines or Thailand, to a point where it was roughly 6 months of the year in a number of the last few years. Got an apartment in Thailand, again doing the refining process. First I picked all my favorite hotels, narrowed it down. We'd go back to my favorite hotels, my favorite routines, my favorite place to rent a motorbike. Then I got my favorite apartment. Then I rented the apartment next door to my favorite apartment and set up my artist studio. And so now there's my favorite restaurants, and then there's my favorite waitresses in the restaurant and waiters in the restaurant, my favorite place to do hair, my favorite place to have massage, teaching people how to massage my body the way that relaxes me and is a healing experience. So it's that same thing of creating a home on the other side of the world, and bringing my wife into my home here for the first time, living with someone, for an extended period of time, again, refining it and making it our home. Getting everything just set up for both of us was kind of the first 6 months of, very intentionally managing nuance. And we're just doing the last bit of that today, with, getting her the ideal car for our lifestyle and stuff like that. And so this is my journey through travel. And one other thing I'll mention, having spent half the time in the U.S. initially, the first 10 years, and then spending a fair amount of time outside of the U.S., is that the experience of bilocation and identification, because when I first moved to England at age 10, everyone saw me as an American, and I saw myself as an American. But then I rapidly identified as being British, and then looked back at America the way the British look at America. And then when I got back into America after detouring in Canada, I was then looking at America the way Canadians or British look at America. And the most fascinating thing in consuming news, for example, and doing analytics, what one finds that world news in England is different than world news in America, is different than world news in Canada. This is fascinating because it tells you that news is incredibly subjective. You'll hear about a landslide in Bangladesh on the BBC. You don't hear about a landslide where 6 bus dump. You don't hear about that in world news in the United States. And it's very interesting to understand that people just make up this stuff and call it news. And then realizing things like I liked British news more than I liked U.S. news. So I would listen to the BBC World Service on shortwave in the United States rather than listen to world news in the United States. And sometimes I'd compare notes. And this generally, I think, ties into the growth of a thinking and design analyzing pattern. Because once you realize that millions of people think they're right and think this, and then over here, millions of people think they're right and think that, and then over here, millions of people think they're right and think this, you realize that all you have to do is get a few million people together in a given location, and they will all kind of conglomerate into a majority that thinks a certain way and thinks that's the way to do it. In other words, the Americans don't get together and say, we think this and it's wrong. The British don't say, we think this and it's wrong. Nobody thinks they're wrong. Everyone thinks that their way of doing things is the way of doing things, the way that good, healthy people would do things. And you realize that statistically this cannot be the case. And if there is a right way, and you realize that every group of people thinks and sees things differently than every other group of people, then the obvious conclusion is that 99% of the time, 99% of the people are wrong. Because there's so much diversity of opinion, news, etc., that if they all think they're right and there's one way of doing it, one way of thinking, etc., and they're all thinking it in different ways, then it means that 99% of the time, 99% of the people are wrong. And while I don't fully believe that, because I actually think that where just about everyone is wrong is thinking that there's one way and not doing the underlying design analytical, piecemealing of things apart. It definitely leads to a dismissal of anyone who thinks with confidence that they're right. Because the odds of them being right are 99% against. I mean, they've got a 99% chance of being wrong because they're working within a paradigm in which there's one right way, and they're not acknowledging those odds, which means most of the time when I dig, beneath someone's thought structures and they say, well, this is the way to do things. And I say, well, referencing what values exactly? So you say that's the way to do things, and it may be more efficient to do it that way. But are you saying that efficiency is more important than presence, for example? Are you saying that in your world, you'd rather get things done efficiently than be present and alive in your world? Are you saying that you value the one more than the other? And it turns out they haven't thought about that. They don't understand the concept of a value hierarchy. They haven't analyzed their own value hierarchy, and they are not metricing. They're not measuring their strategy for whatever it is they think they're right about to a set of values, which means they're not gathering objective data. They're self-referential. They're saying my way is the right way because I say it's the right way, and I say it's the right way because it is the right way, and it is the right way because I say it. It's a completely self-referential loop, and the United States is wonderful at self-referential loops when it comes to culture and news and media. They just look at their own values and say that those are the right values, and because they're the right values, everyone ought to be adopting them. But there's no analysis outside of a culturally self-referential thought loop, that just goes round and round and round. So you realize you can't talk to someone like that because they don't think. So it doesn't really matter what they say if it's completely self-referential, A, and B, they don't understand the difference between self-referential and value-referenced, to something outside themselves, and then they haven't done the analysis. But they're right because they're right, because they're right, because I'm right. And I'm right because look around me. I look at my cult. My cult, we're all doing this type of thing. And that was tremendously liberating for me to understand that people will continue to do bizarre and idiotic things relative to a certain set of values that have not been analyzed indefinitely, simply because that's the way it's been done. In my house in England, for example, the key to my room was this long. The key head was this tall. It was a very simple. It was like a castle with towers. Had this big thing. It was heavier by a factor of 5 than any key I'd seen in the United States. It was 3 to 4 times bigger. So there was 400% more metal consumed, 400% more weight, 500% easier to pick the lock. It was clumsy, cold, heavy, awkward, easy to make duplication. It was a joke. This was being recently manufactured at some, local factory because that's how they'd made keys in England for hundreds of years. It was the only thing. And you'd never see something that dumb relative to efficient carrying of keys in the United States. Okay, so one for the United States. Then you look at the low flush toilets, which were all the rage at the time in England, that I'd never seen in my life in the United States. They had one button for urine and one for feces. Well, I'd never seen that before. It saved 50% of the water. Didn't take any more effort to manufacture, nothing. America was proud to continue wasting 50% of its septic water for decades after that. They're only now beginning to catch up in some toilets. Well, it's the exact same dynamic. And so these were the things that broke open the idea of copying majorities, whoever they were, whatever was being copied, simply because everyone's doing it. And that thought process and the analytics that go on in figuring it out are the same thought process that allow me to say, well, if 85% of the women I talk to complain about the dates they're going on, then stop doing what everyone's doing and create peak experiences. Only now you have a new problem that in the same way that if you'd asked the British to buy American locks and stop lugging around huge keychains that look like ancient dungeons, key rings and stuff like that, it doesn't matter how intelligent it is. They're used to that. And so they're going to do it. And then you get into food and stuff. You know, you like eating grasshoppers and you like eating eggs, where the more marinated, if the egg has been in pickled vinegar for 10 years, it's more valuable than if you just had salt and pepper on it. I don't like the taste of vinegar eggs. I like salt and pepper eggs. Why? Well, I was born in a culture where you had salt and pepper on your eggs. And so you realize it means absolutely nothing. Food is out the window. Dating protocols are out the window. Marriage strategies are out the window. You know, housing the whole thing is up for grabs. And they're all things that are strong, referencing certain values. Certain strategies or protocols are good, referencing certain values, and they're terrible for other values. And we're in a psychologically illiterate culture that doesn't even take the time to teach people to think, let alone make the connection between this strategy is good for this, this, and this, and it's simultaneously and paradoxically bad for this, this, and this. So what are you going to pick? Do you want efficiency or presence? Do you want beauty or low cost? Or do you want conformity or intelligence? You know, there's so many different things to choose from. And my continuing interest in travel is now to meet the wider probability field of the human psyche, which has developed in microclimates that reflect the environmental climate of those cultures. Every culture has something to teach me, and I have something to teach every culture. In that face, with an equal give and take, there can be a valuable exchange. So not to look at the Eiffel Tower or the Grand Canyon, etc. I'm now interested in travel to meet unique people for unique reasons.